At this point, I'd like to introduce Michelle Crim. She's the Climate Action Programs and Policy Manager for the City of Portland, Climate and Sustainability. Michelle?
All right, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I sort of am a loud talker, so is this too loud or is it seem okay? So I'm here to tell you a little bit about Portland's climate story, some of our history, let you know about some of the actions that we're taking, the challenges that we're facing going ahead. What my hope is that you'll hear some things today or maybe see some things today that will spark some ideas for you about what makes sense here in the Bend region and in Central Oregon in terms of moving forward and building on the great work that's underway to address climate change. What my goal is to not tell you that you should do things just like Portland does them, because to have a successful climate action plan, you really needs to be customized for the community that it is serving, because each community has its own unique community values and priorities and issues and visions. And so the climate action plans need to really be customized to be serving those interests. And so you can't just take something that maybe has worked somewhere else and plop it down in a new location and expect it to work. And in all honesty, I'm guessing that for most of you wouldn't want to do things exactly like Portland, because Portland is, well, Portland, right? And so we're a little weird in Portland, and while I would like to say that the Portlandia show is not true, I would be hard-pressed to say it's not based in reality somewhere. So we're a little weird and a little quirky. We tend to do things our own way. Portland tends to be a very grassroots, do-it-yourself, sort of to blaze your own path sort of a community, and that holds true for our climate work as well. So, if you want to share your grandmother Clarabelle's meatballs with the world, you build a cart and you sell them on the sidewalk. If you need to get your transistor radio or your toaster or your electric candelabra fixed, you take it to the community center and your clever neighbors fix it for you. If you're worried that the bike rack is going to get a chill, you knit it a sweater. If you need a place for your mother-in-law to stay on yet another visit, you build her a little shack in the backyard out of reused and recycled building materials. If you're concerned about the speed of the traffic coming down your street, you get together with your neighbors and you reclaim the intersection as a community space. If you have blackberries and other weeds in your piece of property in downtown Portland, you bring in a herd of goats to live there and do the landscaping for you. If you think that your kid's school has too much pavement and not enough green, you get together with the parents of other kids and you pull up the pavement and you plant some gardens. If you're frustrated that your community doesn't have a park, you get together with your neighbors and you plan and you build a park yourself. So these are, there's this narrative about Portland that's told by others, either, TV shows like Portlandia or travel magazines or New York Times articles. And it sort of creates this myth about Portland that it's this green utopia and that it's some sort of weird, unique place where things are possible there that just aren't possible anywhere else because it's just Portland, But in reality, we really come from the same place as most other mid and large-sized cities in the U.S. We have a shared history. And that shared history certainly was really focused on cars. And so this is an old postcard that says across the bottom, Foster Road is now the widest street in the city. So we were really proud of the fact that we were building those big streets for the cars. And this is a great example. This is Burnside, which is one of the major arterials in downtown Portland. And in order to make room for the cars, we actually removed the front of the buildings, chopped off 20 feet of the buildings, and put the front back on in order to widen the street. So you can imagine, in the name of progress, that this is where we were headed. So inevitably, we started to have conflicts between these cars and streetcars, and so our solution was to get rid of the streetcars and pave over the tracks. So as you can imagine, we started to have a lot of the issues that you see in a lot of other cities across the U.S. air quality being one of them. We had horrible air quality in the 70s. We also really destroyed communities in the name of progress. So whether it was urban renewal or building freeways, we completely just wiped neighborhoods off the map. I think the picture on the right, you can see where neighborhoods were just completely wiped clean in order to clear the way for a freeway. And so here, if you were low-income communities, immigrant communities, communities of color, you know, it was pretty easy for the city just to come through and wipe you off the map in the name of progress. So we have this shared history, and somewhere along the way, we started to make different decisions. And often that impetus to make different decisions came from community desires and community protests, and the community coming together and saying, we want a different future. This is not the direction we want to be headed. So some examples of that, this parking lot was slated, it's located right in the heart of downtown Portland, and it was slated to become a 10-story parking structure. Does anyone know what it is today?
Pioneer Square.
Yeah, Pioneer Square. So it's known as the Portland's living room, and it really now serves as the anchor and the hub for the transit system in Portland. Another example, Harbor Drive was pulled up and replaced with Waterfront Park. Here's another, I think, great view of it. And so we began to have this vision of a city that was built to serve people rather than to serve cars. We took abandoned railway and warehouse districts and created a vibrant communities where people could move out of the suburbs and back in to the heart of the city. We were also into building freeways like a lot of other cities in the US. This map here of Portland, the red lines are the freeways that we built, and the green lines are all the freeways that were planned to be built. So you can see we had quite a web of freeways planned across the city. And one of those freeways was the Mount Hood Freeway, which is where the blue arrow was pointed. And that was the next freeway we were going to build. We had the federal dollars to build it. We even had started elements of the construction. You can see the ghost ramp there on the left-hand side. So downtown, there are all these freeway off-ramps that were supposed to go to these other freeways. And the community said, enough, no more of this building freeways, and they put a stop to this Mount Hood Freeway. And instead, we used those federal dollars to create what is now the beginnings of the MAX light rail system. So so why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you this because I think often, especially when you're coming from a presentation like what we just had, climate change can feel really daunting and almost impossible to make a difference or to change our trajectory. And I think the Portland story, which I'm going to tell you more about now, is I think a good reference to say that, you know, the future doesn't have to look like the past, and we can shift things into a different direction. So I'm hoping that you'll see some things or hear some things that will help you think about how the Bend region can contribute to that shift. So everybody has a role to play, businesses, residents, nonprofits, academia, and government. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is government role, and particularly local government, city government, and talk to you about some of the things that we're doing. Portland has been working on climate change for a long time, almost 25 years. We were the first city in the United States to adopt a climate action strategy in 1993. It's the one there on the left, complete with the floppy disk drive that it was stored on. And then we updated that plan in 2001, again in 2009, and most recently last year we adopted our fourth plan, which is the 2015 Climate Action Plan. And this Climate Action Plan outlines the roadmap for the city of Portland to achieve an 80% reduction in carbon emissions below 1990 levels by 2050. So that's our long-term goal. And a lot has changed since we adopted that first strategy. Here are just some of the little factoids. Portlanders use 14% less energy than they did in 1990, use less gasoline. We have one of the highest bike commute rates in the country, 9 times the national average. We have one of the highest recycling rates in the country, 100 million rides on transit every year. Electric vehicles are becoming a common sight on our streets. Solar panels are becoming a common sight on the tops of our houses and businesses. Lots of green buildings, eco roofs. We've done a lot to restore natural areas, remove invasive species, plant trees. And then we also try to walk the talk and make sure that the city government operations are as efficient as possible. And through those efforts, we have reduced our annual energy bills by over $7 million a year. So you add all of that up and it results in some real reductions in carbon emissions. So this graph starts in 1990 on the left and then 2014 on the right. The blue line is the carbon emissions trend for the United States. The red line is the carbon emissions trend for Multnomah County, where Portland is. And so you can see the US is up 8% in terms of carbon emissions from 1990. Portland is down 21% since 1990. And it's even more than that if you were to be measuring it from our peak in 2000. So that is, I think, tells an interesting story about this shift that Portland has made to move away from the national trend. And it's even more remarkable when you consider that this is total carbon emissions. So during this same time, in this graph here, our population has grown by 33%. The number of jobs have grown by 24%, so population, the top jobs. Our total carbon emissions have come down by 21%. When you look at it on a per person basis, we're down to a 41% reduction below 1990 levels per person. So we have a lot more people, a lot more jobs, and we still have been able to see drastic reductions in total carbon emissions. But we have a long ways to go. So this graph, it's the same. United States is the red line on the top, Multnomah County is the blue line, and the orange line is the trajectory that we need to be on in order to hit that target of an 80% reduction by 2050. So I think we can be proud of ourselves for what we've accomplished, but we can't rest on our laurels and sort of say, well, we've done our part, because we have a long way to go. And so the other thing, in addition to addressing our carbon emissions, we're facing a lot of other challenges that we need to address and that are also going to put upward pressure on those carbon emissions. And one of those is growth. So by 2030, which isn't even 15 years from now, Portland is going to have 123,000 new households. So that's bigger than the population of Bend. It's almost as big as the Bend metropolitan area in just 15 years. And we expect to have 140,000 more jobs. So a lot more people, a lot more jobs. That's definitely going to put some upward pressure on our carbon emissions. So we need to figure out how to manage this growth in a way that is going to enable us to continue that downward trajectory. Another big challenge we have is jobs. So 140,000 new jobs. We need those jobs to be good jobs, and we also need those jobs to be helping us build an economy that is transitioning away from the use of fossil fuels. And so we're really focused on clean tech jobs and green jobs, whether it's renewable energy. The guy in the middle there is building a new light rail line. Bike shops in Portland, bike shops and bike manufacturers contribute over $90 million a year to the Portland economy and provide over 1,500 jobs. So, these types of jobs are the types of jobs we want those 140,000 jobs to be a part of. The graph on the left shows that clean tech jobs, which includes energy efficiency, renewables, waste management, those jobs have outgrown other job sectors in Multnomah County, even during the recession. So the clean tech jobs are the blue line on the top, and all the other job sectors in Portland is the orange line on the bottom. And so you can see that it definitely is something that's beginning to drive our economy, and really I think is going to help us do that transition away from a fossil fuel economy. Another big challenge we have is affordability. Much like Bend, all of Portland's housing prices are on the rise. The rental market is completely out of control. There are some neighborhoods in Portland that have seen a 10% increase in rental prices every year for several years in a row. And so, this is a huge challenge for us, because what's the point of building a vibrant, low-carbon community if everyday people can't afford to live there? And so we really have to figure out how to build more affordable housing, and at the same time make sure that that housing is helping us to reduce carbon emissions. And I think we often tell ourselves that it's an either-or situation. You can either have affordable housing or you can have green housing, but you can't have both. And that just simply isn't the case. And so we have to figure out how to change that narrative and make sure that we're really achieving both of those goals at the same time. And lastly, access. Access is a big issue for Portland. You know, we've been working on climate change for almost 25 years, but all of the benefits that have come from those efforts have not equitably benefited everyone in Portland. So we like to think of ourselves as this place where you can bike commute even with 6 kids pretty easily. But in reality, big sections of the city look more like the picture on the right. And you know, there's no way that you're going to be hauling your kids around or riding your bike really much anywhere if that's what your streets look like. So we have huge access issues. And just to give you a couple of examples to sort of illustrate how big of a problem this is for us. This is a map of Portland. The shaded peach-colored areas are census tracts that have higher percentages of low-income people living there. And the blue lines represent frequent transit service. So you can see if you live in East Portland, which is inside the red circle, and you're a low-income person, your options to take transit anywhere are almost non-existent, especially if you want to travel north-south. The same is true for sidewalks. So here the little purple lines are all sidewalks. And you can see in East Portland, there's not a lot of little purple lines. And so as climate planners, or even advocates, when we're out there telling Portlanders, you should ride your bike and take transit and walk, and that's the secret to, you know, our carbon dilemma, that's not an option for a significant portion of the city. And if we're going to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, there's no way that we can accomplish that if we're leaving 1/3 of the city out of the equation. So we have to address these access and equity issues. So to address sort of all of those challenges plus reduce carbon emissions, we developed these climate action plans. And so again, we just updated our most recent one in 2015. And this plan, and all of our plans are really living documents where this one contains probably close to 240 actions that the city of Portland or Multnomah County plan to take in the next 5 years, so for us by 2020, to keep us on that downward trajectory towards that 80% reduction. And those actions fall in all of these various categories. So rather than sort of going through the categories and telling you about what we're doing, I thought instead I would just talk to you a little bit more about how we approach this work, because I think that might be interesting information for you as you think about sort of the actions and the things that need to be moving forward here in this region. So we have, you know, whether we're working on energy efficiency or waste reduction and composting or food or preparing for the impacts of climate change, we have a variety of tools in our climate action toolbox. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how we use these different tools in Portland. So the first one I want to talk about is technical assistance, and the example I'm going to give you relates to solar panels. So one of the biggest challenges we found to getting people to install solar on their roofs was just the process was really daunting. You had to figure out the permitting and the contracting and what kind of things were you going to buy, and you know, panels did you need to get, and the incentive structures, and it was just really overwhelming. And so what the city of Portland did is provide technical assistance to a neighborhood group that basically got a bunch of neighbors together, and they did like one big purchase of solar panels for their roofs. And so by us providing that technical assistance, they were able to navigate that process pretty easily, and essentially neighbors could just sign up to get solar panels installed on their roof, and a lot of it, all of the other details were taken care of for them. So that was so successful. You can see the map on the left. The little dots there represent solar installations compared to the map on the right. And so it really lowered those barriers, and we took that program out neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood, and neighbors got together to install solar on their roofs. Another tool that we can use is outreach and education. So often, more often than not, people want to do the right thing, but they sometimes just need a little bit of information or some resources to help them sort of get over their hump and change their behavior. And so for the last 20 years, probably more than 20 years, we have held annual Fix-It fairs, they're called, and we hold several of them a year. And we basically bring together over 60 vendors who come in to share information and resources and help people get the information or sort of free tools and resources they need to do everything from weatherize their homes to gardening to figuring out how to ride their bikes to get their kids to school, like all sorts of things. And so 1,500 people a year attend these events and are given this information, which is available also in multiple language. And there's classes and workshops you can take. You can get your bike fixed or household good fixed, clothing fixed, etc. So it's this great free event that really, I think, excites the community and gives them the resources they need to take action. Engagement is another important tool that we have in our toolbox. The example on the left is when we were developing the 2015 Climate Action Plan, we knew we needed to address these access and equity issues, and so we created a climate equity working group, and this was made up of representatives from organizations that serve Portland's low-income communities and communities of color. And we paid these people to come and work with us every single week for several months, and we went through every single action in our climate action plan and worked with these community members to make sure that those actions were driving us towards our equity and access goals. Another example is community activism, which is a really important component of any city's climate work. And the example here, just here in the next month or so, Portland City Council is going to be considering some new code or laws that would prohibit the installation of fossil fuel infrastructure, which means that the companies that want to build facilities in Portland to enable them to export coal and oil and propane or gas to China or anywhere else are not going to be able to build those facilities in Portland. So it's a really landmark policy, yeah, right? But I can tell you that that policy option came from the community. It came from this group of activists, this is them in City Hall, really lobbying for the City Council to take this bold step. And there's no way that it would be possible without that community activism driving it for us. Another great tool that we have is recognition. So residents, businesses are often motivated by recognition and competition. And so we have a variety of programs that sort of take that angle on things. This one program here is called Sustainability at Work. And we have staff who provide technical assistance to businesses to help them improve their sustainability practices, everything from energy to water to recycling and waste and purchasing practices in their fleets. And then businesses become certified at different levels. And then the city then promotes those businesses through articles and blog posts, newspaper ads. We hold big awards ceremonies and do things to really promote these businesses as sustainable businesses. Another thing that city government can do is sort of fill the gap, and by that I mean sometimes there's things that everybody really wants, but there's no logical person to make it happen, and so city government can sometimes step in and kind of kick something off. And I think a great example of that is the new Bike Town bike share program in Portland. I don't know, have any of you seen articles about this or seen this? So this is it just opened just a couple of months ago, and so there are 1,000 of these really bright orange bikes located in over 100 sort of stall locations, like you can see pictured here. And basically anyone, whether it's a tourist or a community member, can just go and basically easily rent one of these bikes, and you can take it for an hour or for a day, whatever you want. And you ride it wherever you need to ride it, and you just drop it off and walk away. So it's this great sort of shared mobility that you can have. I use them all the time to help me get to meetings on the other side of the river. So now instead of having to leave 45 minutes before my meeting, I can leave 15 minutes before my meeting and hop on one of these bikes and get across the city. So this has been wildly successful. In just the first 2 months that these have been available, people have ridden over 230,000 miles on them. So, and that's 9 times around the earth. So in just 2 months. So there was this huge pent up demand, and city government, together with generous sponsorship from Nike, were able to provide this service to the community. Another great tool that we have is planning, land use planning through our code, our land use codes, building codes, infrastructure investments. We're able to change the form and the function of the city over time. And two of the things that we're really focusing on right now, the left-hand side is complete neighborhoods. And so this map here shows the areas that are bright yellow are those areas in the city where people can generally walk or bike to meet their daily non-work needs. The areas of the city that are more pink or purple are those parts of the city where people can't walk or bike to meet their daily needs. And so this is a measure of how complete your community is. Do you have to get in a car in order to go sort of meet your daily needs? So our goal by 2030 is that 90% of the city of Portland is bright yellow. And so we need to look at our land use codes, our investments, all of the things that need to happen in those pink and purple areas to turn them yellow. Another example is growth. So I mentioned 123,000 more people, and where those people end up in the next 15 years is really critical to whether or not we're going to be able to continue to keep that downward pressure on our carbon emissions. And so we just adopted, or we're in the process of adopting our updated comprehensive plan, and that plan really focuses on this notion of centers and corridors. Back in the day, they used to be called nodes and noodles, which I kind of like better, but it sounds much more bureaucratic to say centers and corridors. And so the centers are the yellow circles, and those are different sized neighborhood business districts that, again, allow people to meet their daily needs sort of within close proximity to where they live. That's also the areas where we want a lot of that development, those 123,000 new households, to be in those areas because we want those people located next to all of those services. And so those areas tend to either have or are planned to have higher density than other neighborhood areas. And then the corridors are the lines that connect those centers, and that's where we wanted people to be able to easily take transit, ride their bike to get across the city. And so we have lots of land use codes and policies and other things that are being developed to make that more of a reality. Incentives are another important thing that government can do, both federal level, state level, local government level. We can often provide direct incentives, tax abatements, tax rebates, et cetera, to help offset some of the upfront costs associated with the behaviors or the investments that we want people or businesses to make. An example of that is a program that we created that was called Clean Energy Works. And it essentially was a nonprofit that the city of Portland created and spun off. It later became Clean Energy Works Oregon and is now rebranded as Inhabit. And basically this was a program that brought together contractors, financiers, and other people in sort of this bundle of incentives to make a one-stop shop where people could easily get what they needed in order to make improvements to their home, to upgrade their furnace, install new windows, put insulation in their walls. And so it was this bundling of all of these services and these incentives to make it really easy for homeowners to make these investments in their home. And so speaking of investments, where a city spends its money, where it makes investments also makes a difference. And so this is this example here shows the percent of bike commuters in Portland. And I think what's important here is it wasn't that long ago, in the year 2000, that all of these cities, Portland, Minneapolis, Seattle, DC, San Francisco, these places that are known as places where you can ride your bike to get where you need to go, we were all pretty much in the same place. The city of Portland has spent a lot of money and energy installing bike lanes, bikeways, bike traffic signals, bike signage, lots of outreach and education and other motivational things to get people on their bikes. And so as a result of that, making those investments in time and resources, we've been able to dramatically increase the percentage of bicyclists who commute in Portland.
Where's the dollar investment side? I assume the percentage is the ridership?
The percentage is the ridership, yeah. That's I should look at that. It's not that, especially if you compare it to investments that are made for car infrastructure. Bike infrastructure is super affordable. And in Portland, one of the things that we've moved towards is what we found is that a lot of our major arterials have bike lanes on them, but a lot of people, particularly families, they don't want to ride on those streets because they're busy. And so what we've started to do is identify the next street over that has quiet, more residential, low car traffic. And so there you just, paint some things on the road and put up some signs, and it's a pretty affordable investment. Another example of investments I think that's important to consider is where you don't spend your money. So this is the Tillicum Crossing, which is the new bridge in Portland. It's the first bridge that was built in the last 40 years. And the bridge carries light rail streetcars, buses, bikes, and walkers, but no cars. So we spent almost $140 million on a brand new bridge for no cars. And so I think that sends a really strong message in terms of where our priorities are and where our vision for the future of the city is at. So the last couple of examples here, one of the things that we can do are pilot projects. And so pilot projects are a great way for a city to test things out, whether it's policy options or maybe new technologies, new building materials, to see what works, what doesn't work, what the barriers are, et cetera. So the example I want to give you is a program we developed that was called the Kilowatt Crackdown. And basically this was a similar sort of recognition competition sort of a program where commercial building owners in Portland, so the big office buildings, other types of business buildings, could participate, and we helped them with technical assistance, evaluate what the energy performance was of their buildings, and then help them get the resources and information to make improvements to that, and then sort of have this competition and awards, and again promoting those businesses and those building owners. And it was a really successful program, so much so that lots of other cities across the U.S. developed similar programs and rolled them out. And I think one thing that surprised me about this is it's amazing how many building owners and building managers have no idea what the energy performance of their buildings are. They just pay the energy bills when they come in, or they pass those costs on to the tenants of their buildings, but they're not actively managing and improving the performance of their buildings. And so by getting them to start to pay attention to that, you can really begin to engage them in that conversation. The challenge is, if we're going to get to an 80% reduction by 2050, we have to have all of the commercial buildings in Portland operating at the optimum efficiency. And so what we found through this pilot study is that in order to get them to do that, we have to make them do that. And so sometimes we have mandatory requirements. And so we took what we learned from that Kilowatt Crackdown, and we just last year adopted a requirement that requires all commercial building owners in the city of Portland with buildings over 20,000 square feet to figure out their energy performance and report it to the city of Portland, where then it becomes public information. And so we now have laws on the books that makes them do it. We also provide technical assistance to help guide them through that process. And so we have just finished the first year of this policy, and we've learned some really interesting things. One thing that we've learned, sort of the bars represent different types of buildings. So at the top is like wholesale club, kind of Costco-y type buildings, medical offices. Towards the bottom here you have regular offices, retail stores, etc. And one of the things that we found, we've never had access to this information before. The city of Portland we can't look at somebody's energy bill and figure out what their performance is. And so what we've been able to figure out from this policy is that a lot of Portland's businesses or buildings are operating at a higher efficiency level than they are nationally. So we have a lot of really good performing buildings in our building stock. But we also have some laggards, so those Costco type buildings, medical offices, which I think is really interesting, are performing below sort of the national median. Another thing we learned from the data that we got this last year is that a lot of Portland's really old buildings are actually performing better than the new buildings. So we often have this notion that the old buildings aren't performing as well, and we actually found that that's not necessarily true. So what this does is it engages those building owners in looking at their performance. They can then benchmark their performance against similar buildings in function as size and age and see how they're doing. And so it can inspire them to make changes. And it also helps the city figure out where we need to target our investments, our technical assistance, and our policy work to really make sure that we're focusing on the right buildings in order to get everybody on the other side of that line. A couple of other examples of mandatory requirements. We, in part because of those tremendous growth pressures that we're facing, homes were just being bulldozed left and right in Portland. And that's a problem from a climate perspective because of the embodied energy in those building materials that are essentially just being knocked down and taken to the landfill. And so we adopted a policy last year that says that any home that is 100 years old or older, and there's a lot of those in Portland, you have to deconstruct it piece by piece, and all of those building materials have to basically go on to be available for reuse. And so that was a pretty big policy decision. And I think getting back to that green jobs goal that we have, you can imagine the amount of sort of skill and labor that it takes to deconstruct a house piece by piece than to have a bulldozer knock it over and haul it to the landfill. And so we have been developing, we have training programs and other things to help build the market, the labor market, as well as the market for the materials that come from these buildings. And over time we'll be able to really, I think, build a very robust deconstruction and material reuse market in Portland. And lastly, the last example I want to give you of a mandatory requirement in the next month or two. Right now the city of Portland is looking to adopt a law that would require that homeowners disclose the energy performance of their house at the time they put their house up for sale. And so it's similar to the miles per gallon sticker on a car, where that's really important information for a prospective car buyer to know what is the sort of the long-term operational costs associated with that car. And we want people to have that same information when they're looking at buying a house. What is it going to cost them to operate that house? And then ultimately, the goal is that by having that will create the right market signals to encourage homeowners to make those energy efficiency investments in their homes, to make their homes basically more marketable when and if they choose to sell them. So we all know a remodeled bathroom helps you sell your house, and we want insulation and windows to also help you sell your house. And so we think that this requirement will help to create that market. And so we'll see. We're not to the finish line yet. This is a very controversial policy, as you can imagine. And so we'll see whether or not it makes it to the finish line. And so that brings us back to where we started, to Portlandia. And, I think shows like Portlandia create this sort of vision of a low-carbon community for Portland that, is where we pickle everything and we, dress our chickens in pink sweaters and send them to college, and we debate whether or not you can put fingernail clippings in the composting bin. But that's not our low-carbon vision for ourselves. And instead, our low-carbon vision is to create a city that is healthy, where our climate policies and our investments are creating opportunities for people to take advantage of active transportation options like walking and biking and taking transit. We want people to have ready access to affordable fresh fruits and vegetables. We want to have brought nature back into the city so that people can stay cooler and the air can be cleaner and that they can have plenty of opportunities to recreate and get outside. We also want to ensure that our climate policies and programs are really supporting the local economy and creating demand for innovative solutions that are helping us to improve efficiency and move away from fossil fuels. We want to have our climate work create a resilient city where we have healthy, robust natural systems that are going to help us be more resilient to the coming impacts of climate change. And we want a more equitable city, and we think that we can achieve that through our climate work. So again, making sure that communities that have historically been marginalized by our climate action work, and in Portland that includes communities of color and low-income Portlanders, that they're brought to the table and that they are welcome to help craft and inform climate policy and climate programs, and that we're prioritizing the quality of life and the economic benefits that come from doing all of this climate work for those communities that have been left out so far. So that's our vision for a low carbon community, and I think you know, your challenge is to figure out how to build on sort of the great work that's already going on, to figure out what your vision of a low carbon community is and what are the actions that need to be taken in order to help you get there. And I want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of that conversation by having me come and speak with you today. And if you're interested in the details of what's in our climate plan, or sort of a lot of the things that I've talked about here today, it's all on the City of Portland's website. And so with that, I think we have some time for questions.
You may or may not know, we here in Bend just passed a climate action resolution. Actually, one of the council members is here today. I don't know if any others are, but so we're very happy about that. One of the community questions, and it's a very good question, is how, and I'm going to relate it to you, how do you work your core? Are you able to provide the core services that a city needs to provide to its citizens and communities, as well as do the climate actions that you're doing through the climate action plan? We're on a 2 to 3 year timetable now to develop a city and community climate action plans. So that's one of the things that we will have to discuss and make clear that we can accomplish all of these.
Mm-hmm. So do you need me to repeat the question, or the answer to your question is, I think our thinking has evolved over the time, and I think we're now solidly in a place where we see that there are several places where the city is not sort of holding up its end of the bargain in terms of core services. Transportation is one of them. You know, just maintaining our infrastructure, things are falling apart. It's the same as the case in most other cities, right? So we are having a hard time taking care of what we already have, much less building new, exciting things. And so, but I think what we now realize is that we can achieve both. Often it's like, well, we can work on this or we can work on climate. And really, you can work on both at the same time, and it just depends on sort of what your path forward looks like. And so, there's no reason that we can't address the affordable housing crisis that we have in Portland right now and ensure that those new housing units that are being built are going to be efficient and cost effective for the people living in them, and so I think it's just reframing things as not an either or, but as a yes and kind of a both and, that we can achieve both. And in many cases, we're able to better the example of the bike lanes versus car traffic, right? It's much easier and cheaper to maintain bike infrastructure. The bikes aren't tearing up the roads like the cars are. And so if we can continue to transition people into sort of those greener activities, often in the long run, it costs the city a lot less money, and we're able to meet those core services a lot more cost effectively. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, it looked like the carbon emission was really starting to go down like 2000, 2001, and everything was business as usual until then. Is there anything that really made a big difference at that time? Right. And the second question is, what kind of incentives or programs or ordinances do you have to really encourage new planting and actually an ecologically vibrant part of the climate solution?
Like new planting by?
Just incorporating vegetation into an urban landscape.
Right. So the question related to why did we see that sudden drop in 2000? And I wish there was a really crisp, clean answer for that. And it sort of is like lots of things happened at the same time. And really, in a lot of ways, I think it was this culmination of really 20 years of making those different decisions. And over time, they just added up to this sort of critical mass where things started to take a dive down. So getting around the city by light rail and by bicycle became much more viable around 2000. There were some industries that left Portland, some really energy intensive aluminum smelter sort of industries that left Portland. But it really is sort of in some of the factoids I showed, we just sort of step by step started reducing our fuel use and our energy use, and it just kind of all came together and just sort of spun off. And so there isn't like a clear thing that we can point to, and it's really frustrating because it's a very dramatic drop all of a sudden. But I think the fact that we've been able to maintain that downward trajectory shows that it's this culmination of lots of things rather than just one thing that, one thing would drop us a little bit, but then we would either flatline or start coming back up. So it's this constant downward pressure that we keep trying to maintain. In terms of incentives that we have for plantings, and there are lots of different things. So for example, for homeowners, we have a rebate I guess that's different. That's disconnecting their downspout. Well, we call it a tree bait. So basically, we'll give you money back on your water and sewer bill if you have certain types of landscaping and have disconnected your downspouts. We offer money to help people, especially low-income people, plant trees and take care of those trees. We have requirements that for new development that says, the type of landscaping that you have to have, and we're looking at those requirements right now because in a lot of ways they're not going to help us address the urban heat island effects that we are already experiencing and that we expect to see in the future. And so we're realizing now we need to really dramatically potentially shift what we require people to plant in their developments, et cetera, to help us achieve those goals. So I think it's sort of all of those different tools. I could probably talk to the right people and come up with examples in each of those categories where we're trying to drive towards that, bringing nature into the city and increasing the planting. Yeah.
I was wondering about sewage and water. It's not as probably as necessary in Multnomah County as it is in Central Oregon. But what is the situation with the provision of water and also the water use and also of sewers?
So Portland is really unique compared to other cities in Oregon where we have plenty of water. And we expect to have plenty of water into the foreseeable future. And that's because we have, our water comes from the Bull Run watershed, which is a rain-fed watershed. So for a lot of Oregon communities, the fact that there isn't snowpack to sort of hold onto the water is the huge issue. So there's no way to hold onto the water. Well, we don't rely on snowpack, so if we have more rain and less snow, it doesn't really affect us, and we have reservoirs where we can hold the water. And so we have plenty of water. We also have groundwater wells that is a duplicative system. That being said, it's still really important that we conserve water and that we're, because it takes a lot of energy and therefore carbon emissions to move that water and pump that water and treat the sewage that results from our use of that water. And so we still are really aggressive about conservation efforts, but we're positioned really well in that we don't expect to have water supply issues. And yeah, so.
And about sewers, how do you manage sewage?
So all of our sewage, by and large, is through a wastewater treatment plant. So the septic systems, et cetera, are not very common in Portland anymore. Most people have been moving on to the city's septic system. And then through that system, that's a very energy-intensive system as well. And so we have, we have very high efficiency sort of pumps, and we generate electricity off of the biogas that's generated at our wastewater treatment plants. And so we've done a lot of work to make them as efficient as possible. How about in the back there?
I want to pick up your comments about transportation equity. You gave the examples to build complete communities in East Portland. It needs a dramatic investment in transit and sidewalks. So how are you, and Bend has similar kinds of issues about building complete communities. So how are you going to ensure that those investments will be made in the places that most need it?
So it's, I think, taken us a long time to get in the mindset that we're in now. But if you were to look at City of Portland budget documents or really anything where we're spending our money, you're going to see them targeted to East Portland. And so we have essentially, as a city, said East Portland is the #1 priority. Everybody else has gotten good stuff already. They can wait. We're going to focus on East Portland for the foreseeable future. And so if you follow the dollars, it's all going to East Portland by and large. The other thing that's happening out there is, so the reason that a lot of that infrastructure doesn't exist is because it was in unincorporated Multnomah County before it was annexed by the city, and so the county didn't have the same development requirements that the city has. And the city has been somewhat lax in requiring, there's requirements that say if you build a new building, you have to put a sidewalk in front of your building. And historically, the city's been like, well, but then there's just a little bit of sidewalk there because nobody's building it next to you. And so we can forego that requirement. And now I think the city is going to get really tough about making sure that the infrastructure that we're responsible for, that we're sending our dollars there, and that we're holding private developers accountable for their requirements for that infrastructure development as well. How about in the very back there?
So I have a question for you. Over time, since you started this 1990, 2000, and now we're 2016, how many staff have you hired over time, or how many do you have now that are implementing all of this policy?
So that's a great question. How many staff? So there's only two staff people in the entire city of Portland that are 100% focused on climate. I'm one of them. And then there's a person in the Water Bureau who is focused on sort of those water issues and the climate connection there. Other than that, it really is existing programs, existing services that sort of we've developed this shared responsibility across the city. So in reality, it's hundreds of staff. You know, there's about 250 actions in our climate action plan, and and so there's probably hundreds of staff who have responsibility for implementing any one of those actions, but they're doing that as part of their everyday work. It's just sort of shifting their core responsibilities of their work a little bit sometimes, and ensuring that they understand the role that they play in the work that they do every day to helping us reduce emissions. And so it's kind of a hard question to answer, but in reality it's a shared responsibility with only really two staff who are just really focused on climate as like their real job, I guess you would say.
I just have to interject here. We're well into our break period. And so if you want to take a break, that's fine. Otherwise, hopefully, those of you who want to keep asking questions, hopefully you will want to stay and answer a few more questions.
Yeah, you betcha. Yeah.
All right, well, we will resume with our next speaker at 11:30.
Oh, do you want me to, I can just keep taking, apparently that's what you guys want to do. Okay, how about back there?
I've been very interested in your bike boulevards or greenways. Are those a way can you use those to substitute for sidewalks? Or do you have to still be infilling the sidewalks on those greenways as well?
So one of the things that we did when we updated our comprehensive plan most recently is we changed the requirements to say, because it used to say, if you're going to build sidewalks, you have to have one on each side and it has to be exactly like this. And what we said is sometimes that's not possible, either from a financial perspective or because of the terrain or topography. And so we've loosened our requirements in certain parts of the city to help us get some of that infrastructure. Most of the bikeways and greenways either already have sidewalks or we would be building those when we come in to build the sidewalks. And so it sort of varies by the neighborhood and the part of town in terms of what the requirements are. But we've tried to make things a little more flexible because, you can have a sidewalk on one side and that enables people to walk, but to not build a sidewalk at all because you can't do it on both sides just didn't make sense anymore. Yeah, how about back there in the maroon color? Yeah.
So I'm just curious how Portland Parks are involved in this movement. Are they working collaboratively with local school groups, or are they giving any kind of clinics to show people best practices on how to garden in their own yards?
So the Parks Department and our Environmental Services, which is the department that's responsible for like a lot of the natural areas that are managed by parks, do a lot of that work, both in the schools and just through events and other volunteer opportunities. And so they're very involved in that. And I think in terms of the climate work, in 2009, the City of Portland really started focusing on climate adaptation. I didn't really talk about that a lot here, but really preparing for the impacts that we expect to face as the climate changes. And so the Parks Department is really critical to that because so much of their services, their infrastructure, whether it's the community center that people can go to cool off during a heat wave or the natural areas that they maintain, they're really critical to that adaptation piece. And so I think it has really plugged them into the climate work even more so than what they were already doing just as part of their core mission. All right.
Following up on an earlier question related to funding, so as you heard, we just adopted a climate action resolution and it calls for climate action planning, but also hiring some staff at the city level. So if it's just that you and somebody else, you can't be running all those various programs you talked about that are across the city. But how are you funding the position that you have and the other person and maybe a few others? Where's the resources coming for that? And how are you justifying those positions? Do they get challenged? Like, that's a waste of money. We should be putting it into, filling potholes or whatever it might be. That is a real source of conflict and disagreement and will be a real challenge for our community going forward because we are very resource constrained. So
right. So my position, I've been at the city for coming up on 14 years, and every single year my position is a position that could go away, and the funding for it is cobbled together from some solid waste tipping fee money, some grant funding. Like, every year is sort of different, but the case is made that this is important work. I think, in Portland we've been doing this for so long that it's sort of a given that we're going to keep doing this, and so there's not the same, I think, pressure that you might face here. I think there's some other positions in Portland, like we have an energy manager, and his position is funded by the savings so he works with all of the different bureaus to improve the energy efficiency of their buildings and their processes, and we track the savings that come from that effort, and his position is funded from that. So that $7 million a year, that wouldn't have been possible without dedicated staff who were driving that every single year and trying to find those savings. And so it's a hard case to make. And I think even for those hundreds of staff that sort of have their jobs over here and now they have some responsibilities to address climate change, it doesn't necessarily, working on the climate work doesn't add to those costs. It sometimes just shifts the work program a little bit, and so we're not often having to sort of detail out, like, we've never really totaled up exactly how many dollars our climate work costs, and in part it's just because that's the business of the city. Our job is to create a city that is livable and equitable and healthy and is going to help us achieve these goals, and so those costs, I guess, are more internalized and not line itemed out. So it's not a very satisfactory answer to your question, I'm sure. It's a challenge. Yeah.
How is accountability maintained for all those hundreds of employees who have just a little bit, and each department needs to make its progress? I mean, where's the accountability piece?
So the accountability piece, one of the key tools that we use, I'm actually doing it right now, is an annual progress report. And so I go back to all of those staff and I say, okay, you're on the hook to do this. What have you done? How are things going? And I put that in a report, and then that goes to city council. And it also goes out to the public. And so that's an incredible motivator, I think, for staff to be recognized for the work that they're doing, and also know that the elected officials and their bosses and everyone else are going to see if they're not doing what they said that they were going to do. And there are examples, even as I'm doing this report, of actions that are not happening. And sometimes there's a variety of reasons for those, but often it's not because the staff just decided they didn't want to do it. And so that accountability piece is really helpful. I think also sort of being able to just see that, because we continue to see that downward trend, certainly if we started to see an uptick, then we would have a lot deeper digging to do, that we would need to figure out sort of what's going on and what's not happening that should be happening. Not over here.
What's your success in sharing your vision with the adjacent Oregon counties, and particularly with Clark County across the river? Right.
So what's our success with sharing our vision with other surrounding communities? And I would say not great. And in part it's because that relationship there's a lot of tension there anyhow. It's kind of that, oh, well, that's Portland. And if they're doing that in Portland, then we're not going to do that because we're not Portland. And so there's this desire to really separate themselves from us because we tend to dominate the landscape, literally and politically and everything else. And so we often just sort of keep our nose down, and we tend to talk with other cities and other parts of the world and other parts of the country more than we talk to surrounding jurisdictions. We try to I think, stay out of their way and encourage them, but we haven't had a lot of success in sort of inspiring them to take action. Yeah, how about over here?
Where's Portland on adopting universal benchmarking for all buildings within their jurisdiction? Universal benchmarking in the sense of getting the annual utility bills per square foot to figure out which facilities are improving and which ones are not.
So the example I gave of that new mandatory requirement that we just adopted last year requires the buildings that are over 20,000 square feet to do that. And then next year, we'll be ratcheting down the square footage to, I think, 10 or 15,000 square feet. And so we'll slowly sort of capture all of those buildings. And then we're going to make that information publicly available, which is similar to the house one. Our goal is that it will sort of create the market drivers to encourage those building owners to make improvements if they want their rental spaces or their tenant spaces to be competitive in the market.
Mine's a perfect follow-up to that. I'm curious what, so you said you provide technical assistance to the building owners to be able to do that. What's the cost involved in building owners like coming up with a number as far as efficiency of their specific buildings?
You know, I don't know because I don't work on that program. I could get you in touch with the people that run that program, and I think it probably varies by building and what state it's in and what it needs. But generally, by and large, most of those energy efficiency improvements, especially for those buildings that aren't performing as well, pay for themselves pretty quickly.
Right, I guess I was just wondering if the reporting itself was a costly process, because I know that
No.
that's been a big contentious thing in Bend as well. It's like, oh my God, trying to get baseline information is gonna be so expensive.
Right. That pilot project helped us figure that out, and in the end, it helped us narrow down exactly what to ask them to do and what the process is.
So getting the information itself was not a costly process?
No, it wasn't. It was scary and intimidating, and it was sort of, people thought it was going to be, and there were some people who needed a lot of hand-holding and others that didn't, but.
But it wasn't expensive. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we need to get on to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you guys for your
Michelle,
interest,
thank
I
you.
appreciate it.